So he is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City and County of Honolulu, the Executive Director, Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. He's just an all-around good guy. How about a nice round of applause for Joshua Stanbro, everybody.
So I'll give $5 right now to anybody that can reproduce that title. Anyone? Takers? So it's not my fault. This title was conferred. I didn't go in and select the title. As with many things that you guys probably deal with on a regular basis, it's kind of ad hoc, comes to you as it comes, and you deal with it as you deal with it. And you sort of make do, creative opportunism, right? So the reason the title is so long is because we're trying to mash about 1 million things under one office. And we're also receiving support from the Rockefeller Foundation, and they have a specific title that they want as well. So we're working hard to figure out how to address a many-headed dragon, just like you guys do every day. So I wanted to say that what a day to talk about climate change. Thank you so much for connecting with the administration and making sure that we had a very relevant panel today for that announcement. It's a tumultuous and really, it's an exciting time. We were just talking before the panel about what the possibilities are. There's doors that are closing, but there's a lot of doors that are opening up because of that. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I'm with the city and county. I'm 3 weeks in as the Chief Resilience Officer, so I'm learning on the fly. I'm so happy to be here because actually learning from this group is going to be really important to the strategy and the plans that we're going to be putting together. We've got a great panel that I'll be learning from as well today. I do have to let folks know, though, that Nancy Lewis is not able to join us today. Her husband had to have emergency surgery, so she's with him. You know, I want to recognize, you know, Mark talked about the really amazing social capital in island communities. So if we can all send some good thoughts to Nancy and her husband right now as a community, I think that would be welcome for her. What's that? I don't know if it goes any higher, but I'll try. So I wanted to make a few remarks before I introduce the speakers, in part because I think it's so timely, given what's going on in the nation. This is really a time for state and local leadership. If we thought somebody was coming to ride to our rescue in the form of a federal government and an island-born president, that is not going to be happening any longer. But really, as always in the history of society, the rubber meets the road at the community and local leadership. And where these emission reductions and where these adaptations were going to take place in the first place, it was always going to be at the ground level. So it's up to us. There's no more sort of looking over our back and seeing who else is going to come help. And we've been talking right before the panel, too, about how, you know, the governor, the mayor, and others at the local level, and everyone here in this room can actually make the things happen that need to happen to avoid some of the issues that Mark was talking about. We've got a real growing awareness, obviously, around climate change impacts. It's hard not to. You saw the king tide issue last week, and there was a lot of hype around the king tides, right? I mean, when news gets a hold of something, it's always, you know, sort of the shaky camera and lightning bolts and everything. But really what it was about was that level of water that we were seeing is going to be the normal level of water a decade or two out. And so really, when you talk about preparing, really it's a preparatory. It's like a preview. You know, you go to the movies and you see a preview. That was a sneak preview of what we need to design for. And so I think, you know, really the real message there was, are we doing the best sort of investment in our infrastructure to keep us safe in going forward? Happily, we do live in Hawaii, and part of the other reason for my title being very long is because it was on a ballot measure in November. And the voters of Oahu established an Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency by a nearly 20-point margin. that gives us the confidence in this room to know that folks have our back. They understand what the reality is. We are an island community. We see what's happening. We have a long historical memory in a place and in a land and in an ocean space where people don't forget what it used to be like and what it's like now. So I think we need to move forward confidently, and I certainly am at the office knowing that the population around us is looking for leadership in this area, and they're willing to establish that and not debate the facts. The other nice thing that happened in the same amount of time is that, as I mentioned before, the Rockefeller Foundation selected Honolulu as one of the 100 resilient cities around the globe. And there was 1,100 cities that applied to be part of that network. And out of that 1,100, Honolulu was selected as one of the 100. And it's really a testament to Mayor Caldwell and the administration for being tenacious, because they applied 3 times before they got it. But it's also, I think, a testament to where we are at kind of ground zero around these things, and the ability for us to learn from the other 99 cities what they're doing in terms of resilience, preparedness around climate issues. And really, when we talk about resiliency, we're talking about sort of shocks that happen and sort of natural disasters and immediate big impact type things. But then we're also talking about stressors. And that's a lot of the work that you all work on in this room, trying to reduce those stressors that make us more vulnerable in the times when shocks come. Our vulnerabilities really sort of are centered around housing, obviously. Natural disaster, climate, but I think that one of the reasons I'm really happy to be here today is that I think that the disease element, and I'm sorry about the feedback, the disease element and infectious diseases and the temperature rise is really a sleeper that a lot of people aren't thinking about, and so I'm really happy to be here to try to get your mana'o to find out how to address that through our office. So we will be developing a resilience strategy over the next 6 months. It's part of the Rockefeller process. We're having a large stakeholder meeting next week with Rockefeller teammates, and we will be putting together, a complex and sort of nuanced at the same time strategy about what the city and county can be doing to make us less vulnerable to the things we see coming down the road. And one of the things that I did want to mention is, I think Mark had mentioned sort of the pre-disaster planning and how important that is, how much that can reduce the impacts. And we're sitting here in Waikiki, and I know Carl Kim and other folks have worked on doing some pre-disaster planning for Waikiki. And when you look at Sandy, when you look at Katrina, there's an opportunity to, essentially when they've done the work on it, you do 50 years of infrastructure redevelopment, urban redevelopment in a 5-year period. If we don't want something like that to happen, but if it does happen, there's an opportunity to redesign and be better and stronger on the back end if you know what you want to build for. And I think that's some of the work that Carl Kim has been doing, and I really appreciate everyone in the room that's looking out over the horizon rather than just having to react in the moment. So that's a little bit of background around the office and what we're trying to do. And I wanted to insert some of that because I think at the end we'll have a chance for question and answer after our panelists go, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that people may have about where the city and county is going on these issues. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll go one at a time. We're going to have a transition in between. So Maxine Burkett is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, and she's a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She's an expert in the law and policy of climate change, and her work has been cited in numerous and policy outlets, including BBC Radio and the New York Times. From 2009 to 2012, Professor Burkett also served as the inaugural director of the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy at UH. She received her BA from Williams and Oxford and received a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. She's a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform and a member of the Federal Advisory Committee for the Sustained National Climate Assessment. for as long as that's around, given the administration. She has a 2016, she's a 2016 recipient of the Williams College Bicentennial Medal for Distinguished Achievement, which brought great joy to her 6- and 8-year-old kids when they thought she won a bronze medal in the Olympics. And I can say that because this is also my wife, and she's a fantastic asset in our house. So.
Thanks for that very biased introduction. You can see I don't have the same mic issues as my husband does. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Josh said, this is an incredibly unusual time in human history for a number of reasons. I think, obviously, the global climate is changing literally the geophysics of it, but so is the geopolitics of it. And I think we can't underestimate that and see that as normal, because in fact, it's not normal on both fronts, and it puts us at risk. And so what's nice about having a little bit more time, I think, with us, without us talking at you, is that we can have more of a conversation. And if there are questions that you have, certainly about the law and policy implications of where we are right now, I'm happy to dive into those. What I was planning to do, which I think sort of feeds really nicely from the prior comments and the keynote this morning, is to talk about what we mean when we talk about climate change and health, and how we can understand that through the prism of the phenomenon of climate-induced migration, which you may know as climate refugees, which as a lawyer I cannot allow you to continue to say, just because refugee has a very specific legal definition, and I'll say more about that later, and can say more even if you'd like in the Q&A. But for the most part, the biggest takeaway is that we have these unusual sort of climate surprises, these unprecedented phenomena that are going to really test the boundaries of our traditional disciplines. And I think that's true for your discipline as it is for ours in law. And law likes to think it's static and as fixed as the laws of nature, but in fact, they really are the laws of human beings and are fallible for that reason. Before I go into the specifics of this talk, I do want to give a little bit of my own background, just to give you some context for why I think these kinds of conversations are so important, and I kind of see myself as someone who works in public health, and that's because my experience with environment and environmentalism, if you will, was through environmental justice. And environmental justice is a sort of a response to the predominant theme of environmentalism that has been more about sort of conservation, removed spaces. Environmental justice is looking not just at disadvantaged communities and disparate vulnerabilities, it's also looking at how we live, work, and play in our environment. That environment itself is those things, and we are ourselves an expression of nature. And so knowing that that's fluid, then you can understand why toxic load matters in cities, why what I call the lead to prison pipeline is a thing, right? The quality of your air, the quality of your home really does determine your IQ, your general mental health. These are inseparable in so many ways. And so I would get a lot of pushback when I was younger. I grew up in New York, Queens, New York, and a lot of my peers were like, who cares about the spotted owl, if you will? I want to just get my kids to school and get them their asthma medication, and all of these things that are very much, again, about where you live, work, and play. And of course, air quality being one element of that, it seemed to me very much about the quality of the environment we were living in. So that's where I come to this, and I see climate change as well as sort of the mother of all environmental risks, or threats to where we live, work, and play. And so obviously the public health implications are going to be a big part of figuring out how we get past this. Or through it is probably more accurate. So I now teach climate change law and policy, among other things, and my research is in climate justice, which again is looking at disparate impact and thinking about, in the domestic and international scale, how we address these issues appropriately and equitably, and understand climate change not just as the scientific phenomenon that's just about weather reporting, but is about human thriving and our children's future. I'm also an attorney, and I teach tort law, so I also do medical malpractice, which I always like to disclose to health communities, but also show that I have a sister who's in the profession, so, it's all good. But I do also, now sort of shifting to the content of my talk, you want to suggest that climate change and health, even the sort of the parallels, the interrelationships even bear out in the data. And my last night as I was preparing this first slide, my husband was like, that looks like a heartbeat. And in fact, it's the global temperature change from 1850 to 2016 by month. So what you're seeing here is an indication of the uptick in average temperatures by months. So we can see that, in fact, even though January is still colder than August for the most part, that each January since 1850 has been warmer, right? And we see this, essentially this rapid increase in beats based on the increase in temperature. It has implications. So what I want to do is just talk generally about climate change and health. I learned a lot in the research on this as I'm preparing some research on migration and health for a book chapter. Then I'll dive into the climate-induced migration phenomenon and say a little bit more about that. I know that was introduced earlier, and I can kind of dive into some of the dynamics of it and what makes it so difficult from a law and policy perspective. And then I'm going to talk about resources, and I think the resources section is particularly important. It's providing just places that all of you can go as practitioners to help with the education on climate change, but also preparing individuals and communities for being able to be more resilient in face of those responses. And it's, I think, especially important that you all have that and you're equipped with that, because yours is the profession that is deemed the most credible and trustworthy to the public. You may be surprised to know that lawyers are not high on that list. And in fact, because of that, I think you have a special opportunity and maybe responsibility to share what you know about the impacts of climate change. So it's a critical task at the end. Okay, so climate change and health. This is another way to see the graph that I showed you earlier, the changes in global temperature since 1850. This is by month. And at the time that this graph was created, 2016 was remarkable. And you're seeing, and 2017 is matching that. And you see the big spike. 2015, right around the end of the year, was shocking to people, jaw-dropping. And then 2016 started up here. There are multiple dynamics here, but this is a trend that you can see is consistent. And why this is such a powerful graph is that it does a lot in one stroke. It's showing you the change in temperature by year, but it's also showing you the change as compared to the global average. And this is important because when you look at these numbers, this is the increase. We've talked a lot about, you may have heard, under 2 degrees Celsius, no increase in temperature beyond 2 degrees Celsius, aspirationally closer to 1.5 degrees. Well, we're kind of already getting to that 1.5. And 2 degrees is not much further on if you think about what's in the pipeline. So this is real. This is happening. We also see in this slide, which is really important, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's document, this is a map that's showing the impacts of climate change that are occurring now that are attributable to climate change. And this is important because attribution, as you know, is really critical. It's critical from a law perspective for other reasons that I can share later. But you need to know that what you're talking about is more likely than not connected to what you are claiming is the trigger. And this is significant because attribution tends to be a very conservative science. People aren't going to connect it to climate change unless they know for sure. And more likely than not, maybe more relevant and more realistic over time. But certainly, if you're looking at this map and seeing impacts that have happened already, these are certainly, with respect to climate change, connected. So many are happening now, and I think it's important to especially look at the red here, which is describing impacts that have been observed attributable to climate change to humans and managed systems, right? And we see that that's occurring across the globe. This does not fully reflect, there's obviously a time lag, but this does not fully affect the impacts to humans and managed systems in the US. Primarily, that's identifying impact to biological systems and physical systems. I think that's, again, the time lag, but also our the lack of data that we've compiled about how humans are being impacted right now in the US. And there's tons of evidence of that, and I'll say more about that later. But here what we see is there's a clear recognition by US-based research programs to understand the impacts of climate change on human health. And this is a table and a diagram that describes climate drivers, the exposure pathways through increased heat, for example, increased temperatures, extreme heat, poor air quality, and then the health outcomes that are impacted. And of course, these things are fluid, so environmental and institutional contexts will matter, as will social and behavioral contexts. These all play into each other. And then the other table is showing you the examples of climate impacts on human health based on the driver exposure, health outcome in that a more sort of readable format. Again, U.S. Global Change Research Program is the resource that has a pretty extensive report on climate change and human health that's a bit more up to date and will be updated with our next national climate assessment. Similarly, the CDC has done work on this. This is another graphic that's showing you the impacts of climate change on health, and it's moving out from the central core of the exposure to the climate impact, the storm, the rising sea levels, rising temperatures, and then what it does to you, and through these other drivers. Another one from USGCRP is linking physical, mental, and community health. Again, seeing that there is a kind of dynamism to how these interact. And I think I could show you many more of these kinds of tables that are describing the human and managed systems impacts in the US. They're copious, inextricably intertwined impacts that convey in sum what was said in 2015, climate change is a medical emergency. And it's doing this in a number of different ways. How does it impact health? Well, there are a number of impacts, and those impacts trigger, amplify, or act synergistically with the others. So I'll focus on infectious disease, heat stress, and heat extremes, and mental health, just briefly. One is, of course, the impact of climate change on natural ecosystems and what it does to infectious disease. And we've seen some description of what that has looked like. It has become very significant when we consider the West Nile virus, the spread of chikungunya, which I have a personal story. In fact, my mother was sick with it, and my entire family in their home in Kingston, Jamaica, which is where I'm from originally. And then, of course, what became quite frightening for everyone was the Zika virus. We are obviously concerned that this will continue over time. And there are a number of disease vectors, many of which are familiar to us here in Hawaii. If we think about another impact, as I mentioned earlier, myriad ways in which it's impacted, myriad ways in which they interact, I'd like to focus on heat stress. You may have seen this image. You guys, does this look familiar to some of you? It was in the Advertiser, and it was a couple of summers back, and it was an article about classrooms and lunchrooms that are incredibly hot. And it was a story that was gripping for me for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that children are considered among the sort of more vulnerable populations when it comes to any kind of medical stresses. And they have a harder time regulating body temperature. They're also growing, and we find them to be sort of bellwethers for whether or not we're doing a good job and taking care. And in this particular instance, they were describing the lack of air conditioning in these classrooms, which is an important adaptation measure, actually. As a climate change person, I was thinking this is an important way to think about how we might adapt. But of course, it was a missed opportunity to discuss the impacts of climate change in our youth and their and our collective future. We could have also discussed important innovations like seawater air conditioning or microgrids in that context. But even more so, there was a little blurb about the possibility of introducing heat days, which, having grown up in Queens, was sort of the parallel to snow days. But when you know that there's snow on the ground, and it makes transportation more difficult and impassable, that's a little bit more of a sort of predictable measure. But heat day seemed interesting to me. I sort of thought, would you set it at 95 degrees? Would you set it at 90 degrees? What happens if it's 89.9 degrees in your classroom? We have a much larger problem here. And more than anything, we're missing out on an opportunity to care for and invest in our children and their education. I know, as well as you, that it's very hard to learn in these kinds of conditions. The last thing I'll say, too, is that what we understand about climate change is not just a change in the climate as we know it now, but it's an increase in the rate of that change. So it's moving more rapidly. This notion of there being a new normal will be as tangible as water, right? Every time we get to a new normal, a new baseline, it will change because, again, the rate of change is what's important with respect to climate change. Now, in terms of mental health and those impacts, I think they underscore all of these and work quite intimately. And this is an image linking physical impacts, mental health, and community well-being that is, I think, quite effective and comes from this report that was just released in March by the American Psychological Association, Climate for Health, and Eco-America. It's an excellent report. I highly recommend it. And key takeaways were many. In fact, that climate actions themselves can support mental health. There are a number of individual, community level, and state level actions that can happen with respect to resilience, community well-being, social cohesion, these things that we do so well in Hawaii were highlighted. But they're also highlighting what we're up against in terms of acute mental health impacts, trauma and shock from storms like Hurricane Katrina. There's tons of data on the trauma that was experienced by those that were suffering as a result of Katrina, were displaced by Katrina, or lost family members. PTSD is a concern, ongoing anxiety. In terms of chronic impacts, there's connections between heat and higher rates of aggression and violence at the household level on up. There's the sense of helplessness regarding the very fact of climate change being so complete, absolute, global, ongoing, and how do we cope with that? That's some of the chronic impacts we need to be thinking about. And in the context of mental health, and I'll pivot here, we can see why climate-induced migration is so significant. I'll give you one example and say more about it later, but the Inuit people in the Arctic have been sort of the canary in the coal mine with respect to climate change and migration. And their understanding about their relationship to the land, which is changing so rapidly and which many have to leave, is that if they don't go out on the land, they don't feel like people. And so there's a real connection there that we're risking majorly severing. So climate displacement, relocation, and migration is perhaps one of the thorniest areas of climate change from a law and policy perspective, and also in addition to the health impacts that it introduces. And so to give you a bit of a primer on what we are talking about, I want to just share a couple of items of data from social science and from the law. This image, I think, is really important just to give a little bit of background. What it's doing is describing the drivers of migration. And the bottom line is that there are multiple drivers of migration. What induces people to move in a normal circumstance? And I can attest to the fact that there are maybe a few things. This image is showing environmental, social, political, demographic, and economic drivers as sort of neatly isolated, but of course we know that they interplay. When my family was moving from Jamaica to New York, I was too young to be a part of the conversation, but I certainly know that there were social and political drivers that were moving my father, and economic drivers. My mom was moving more so probably for social drivers, but maybe if given an opportunity and different circumstances, probably would have stayed. So we know that there's dynamism in this, right? You have drivers, you have a decision point, and then you'll decide whether or not to migrate or stay. And that's under a voluntary circumstance. I'm making a decision to move. In the terms of environmental drivers, I think sometimes you can certainly understand them as triggering the need to move for political or social reasons. Or safety reasons in terms of politics. And I've just put a little footnote on the context of Syria, for example, as having this sort of massive drought that had created even more stress on an already sort of politically tenuous space. But what we see is that environmental drivers may influence all these other drivers, but climate change, again, is a different kind of driver. And it's sort of not your grandmother's driver, in that, as I've mentioned, it's much larger, it's much more dynamic, and it's moving much more quickly. So what we're going to see, we're starting to see it already, but we're going to see more of, is climate change being a primary driver of migration. And what that means for both the communities that will be moving as they're in transition and the host communities is that there's a lot of forward-looking planning that we need to embark upon in order to do this in a coordinated and compassionate way. And we made an attempt in December, the law school, in partnership with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, the last administration's CEQ, the Alaska and Hawaii Sea Grant College Program, our Pacific Islands Climate Science Center, a number of entities had come together to host a symposium on climate displacement, migration, and relocation. And we had numerous community voices. It was a sort of a U.S. perspective, and we were looking at domestic relocation that's happening, and it is happening here. There's somewhere between 12 to 16 communities, primarily in Alaska, the coastal Washington state, Louisiana, Delta region, that are actually in the process of moving. We were trying to figure out how to facilitate that move in an orderly fashion, because we know that there are different kinds of events that will trigger migration that are linked to climate change. And the first are these sudden onset events like Katrina, I mentioned earlier with respect to mental health and trauma. This is what's considered the first disaster. The impact of a major storm that ended up being a Category 5 that took a surprising turn at the end. But this is the second disaster, the preparedness of our systems, right? Our decision-making systems, our pre- and post-disaster planning systems. There's, again, another layer that needs to be considered. There are also slow onset events. They differ from the sudden extreme weather events in that they are more long-term, but provide for a greater planning horizon. So in this scenario, we see the kinds of stories around climate-induced migrations impacting our Pacific Island neighbors. This is the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands is one of the 4 atoll nations that's often described as those that will be essentially uninhabitable for anywhere between 1 to 2 generations from now. And so this is an impact that's over time that will require planning. And it is at this time impacting those communities quite severely. Arctic relocation, I mentioned the Inuit experience. This is similarly a process that's a sort of slower burn, if you will, fast comparatively and certainly geologically speaking, but one that is requiring decisions to move by these community members. What happens in the Arctic impacts those of us also in the Delta regions, for example. So the Ile de Jean Charles community in Louisiana was considered the first official climate refugees in the U.S. because of their history, in which there was sort of decades of oil and gas channelization, the lack of sedimentation because of upstream development on the Mississippi, and sea level rise all colliding, a sort of confluence of events that are making this island uninhabitable. So this is the first community to receive a big tranche of funds from the federal government to move. And Sir David King he's a UK science advisor, and he was talking about Greenland a few years back, and this is a statement from a scientist. He said, the maps of the world will have to be redrawn. And he's right. I mean, this is the climate that this is the map that climate change impacts. This is our domestic map as it's impacted. But of course, there are political boundaries that matter. In our own country, we're going to continue to see millions at risk from sea level rise in the continental United States. They are going to be moving to communities inland. The vulnerabilities across the coastline are somewhat uneven but consistent in the vulnerabilities along the coastline, and will have significant impacts to state population flows, GDP, et cetera. So if you can imagine from the law and policy perspective, there are at least 5 scenarios in which people move. There are at least an additional 5 kinds of categories in which they move. So if we take Katrina's example, sometimes you move temporarily. You have to go to Houston and evacuate. But then you go back home if you have a home. Permanent local displacement were those who stayed in Houston. Permanent internal displacement are those who maybe ended up in Salt Lake City and thought, who knew? I was always meant to be here. I'm going to stay in Utah. Permanent regional displacement is, I think, where many of us joke that we might go after the election to Canada or somewhere. And then permanent intercontinental displacement is when you imagine Pacific Islanders having to move to Australia, New Zealand, or to the mainland US, or when you see images of people heading on boats from North Africa up to across the Mediterranean into Europe. All of these scenarios and categories require different institutions, agencies, sets of laws, domestic, international, and hybrid. And those laws, unfortunately, allow for there to be sort of a political hot potato. And so we have a number of, just on the domestic level, outstanding legal and policy issues that have yet to be addressed. And those don't look at, explicitly even, at least the public health implications of migration. And so we won't ever, well, I can say more about this in the Q&A, but it is really difficult to get to the exact number of people that will be moving. Not that we don't know that it's significant, but the numbers, the specifics around when and how many vary. In fact, it's a factor of 40. Some predict 25 million, some predict 1 billion. And that's like planning for, I actually joke with my students, it's like if my husband came home and said, we're gonna have a dinner party next Friday. Not sure how many people, could be 25, could be 1,000. Let's prepare. That's really, really difficult. So I will say this to you, the social scientists are getting better at having a more precise number, sort of refining instruments to have a more precise number for how many people might move, but that's the specifics, the certainty is going to be elusive. So this is a risk assessment and will continue to be. And so what does that mean for what we understand about climate change, migration, and its intersection with health? We have to look, I think, at historical analogs. If you look at the wider refugee population during the early phases of displacement, that might foretell what the impacts of climate-induced migration on public health will look like. Here's a list of some of them: maternal and child health, malnutrition, the pre- and post-disaster displacement stressors, impacts to mental health, the incidence of chronic diseases, all the things that we've sort of mentioned as far as the way health and climate interact. But we also have to consider some of the social issues that compound: lack of sufficient language services, literacy and cultural concerns. And this is important to view with a lens of compassion and service and forethought, rather than reticence and fear. We've seen articles like this. This is a 4-year-old article talking about the climate-driven exodus from the Pacific Islands, specifically the Marshall Islands, to the United States. And current migration from the Marshall Islands may provide a relevant analog for the ways in which climate migration and health will intersect and impact Hawaii. And because of the wide-ranging health maladies that Marshall Islanders suffer, whether it's TB or diabetes or thyroid tumors or alcoholism and depression, we have to think about how we're going to continue to provide high-quality and affordable health care, which is already driving out migration from places like the Republic of the Marshall Islands to Hawaii and the continental United States. So if climate change can fuel that migration, I think we need to be thinking about the cost of services to additional at-risk populations and how we will serve. Now, how do we do that? I'll go quickly and just tell you that there's resources, and certainly the CDC, to the extent that they will continue to have climate information. I can tell you where all of the climate information is archived from the federal resources. But there has been robust work done on this, and the BRACE model is one that's worth noting. It's building resilience against climate effects. It has 5 sequential steps that comprise the BRACE framework, and is one that you can reference, again, if you go to the CDC page and look deeply at the BRACE model. There are also entities like the American Public Health Association, and they are doing excellent work in translating the physical science out of the national climate assessments into actionable and very user-friendly kinds of climate information. So I highly encourage you to find those resources and incorporate them into the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Burkett. Our next speaker is Scott Glenn. He's the director of the State of Hawaii Office of Environmental Quality Control, where he advises the governor on environmental matters. His office administers the state environmental review process and provides advice and technical assistance to government agencies, businesses, and community groups. Scott also serves as the co-chair of the Sustainable Hawaii Initiative, which Governor Ige announced at the IUCN World Conservation Congress last year, which was incidentally the largest environmental gathering ever held in the world, and supported by our state legislature in large part. The Sustainable Hawaii Initiative focuses on 5 goals: 100% renewable energy, protecting priority watersheds, effectively managing nearshore waters, growing local food, and improving biosecurity. So Scott has an MA in urban and regional planning from the University of Hawaii, and a BA in philosophy and archaeology, which is what I wanted to be when I was a kid, from the University of Evansville in Indiana. He's also a major proponent of measuring our quality of life through the more holistic lens of the genuine progress indicator, instead of simply through the GDP, which we do now, and I think that includes a lot of health measures in the GPI as well. So it's a approach that I really admire and hope we adopt. So, Scott.
Aloha. So first I'd like to ask everyone to stand up, a little bit of exercise at the Public Health Conference. I have a set of questions for you, and if you answer yes, please sit down, okay? So the first question is, I've never heard of the EIS process, Environmental Impact Statement process. Okay, second question is, I have never read an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. The whole thing, or portions thereof. Okay, and then the third question is, I have never commented on an EA or an EIS in any way whatsoever. Okay, well, those still standing, thank you very much for your participation in the EA and EIS process. Okay, so for those who aren't familiar, the environmental review process that my office administers is set up to encourage public participation in government decision-making about certain projects that are going on around the state. It operates at the state level and the county level, and it involves state and county agencies and private parties who are either doing a project in a certain place, like a sensitive environment in the shoreline conservation district or in Waikiki, or they're doing a certain type of project that we care about, such as an oil refinery or landfill, something like that. And so those are the things that tend to go through this environmental review process, and they have to go look at this set of significance criteria to decide whether they warrant an exemption, which means they don't have to do anything further because it's not a big deal, or they should do an environmental assessment, which is to figure out, do we need to do an EIS or not? And then if you figure out that you do need to do one, you prepare this environmental impact statement, and you look at what are the impacts you're having, and you have to propose mitigation measures to them. So this is the list of significance criteria, and I've helpfully boxed out item 5, so you don't have to read anything else but that one. So this one explicitly identifies public health as a reason to require doing an environmental impact statement, and also a reason to require mitigation measures for any impacts to public health. So I bring this to your attention because what is public health? Up until now, in the environmental impact statement process, public health is usually analyzed as an infrastructure and capacity problem. So the EA or EIS will look at how many beds are in a hospital, how many doctors are in a community, and if this project gets built, what would be the change in funding, doctors, beds, things like that. So that's been adequate up till now probably, and it's a good proxy for the availability of resources to respond to a project coming in. Although if you notice number 6 there involves substantial secondary impacts such as effects on public facilities, you could probably get that analysis under item 6. So one of the things that we've been asking is, well, what does a public health impact really look like? And we've been working with Lola and Heidi and Danielle in the preventative division to start exploring this question. And I bring this to your attention because while we're talking about climate change and health impacts, and our keynote helpfully focused on the idea of prevention, this is a point where you, with your experience and knowledge and public trust, can actually intervene in this process and provide your thoughts before something gets built and say, this is something to think about, this is an impact you might be having, and this is a way to mitigate what might be going on. So these are the climate change impacts. This is a very popular slide from some NOAA and from some NOAA reports. And it just gives you an overview of the different types of climate change impacts that are happening. And this is an example from the World Health Organization of how climate change threatens your health. You've probably seen this. Nancy has probably sent it to you a dozen times. I've gotten it from her multiple times. And I'd like to call your attention to some of the items on here. At the top, rural village, small island or coastal town, big city. All three of those are kinds of places that our EIS process applies to. Droughts, floods, heat waves, vector-borne diseases, those are things that we look at in our EA and EIS process. Food, air, water, similarly, those are things that we look at in our EIS process. What we don't really look at, though, are the social determinants of health or the built environment's effect on health. And so what I'd like to show to you guys is this. Has just a little bit more exercise, show of hands. Have you guys seen this health impact assessment? So this was done last year, and it was done by the Kohala Center in support of the Department of Land and Natural Resources making a decision about whether to create a special designated area called a community-based subsistence fishing area. And so the Kohala Center came and said, well, let's look at the health considerations of doing something like this. And so they came up with this health impact assessment. Now in the impact assessment world, we have environmental, we have health, we have cultural, we have all these different types of impact assessments you can do that usually get rolled up into one environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. This was a standalone look that had nothing to do with our law. They just voluntarily decided to go look at this. And the Kohala Center funded it. And Mo'omi is on Molokai, if you're not. And so this is what they looked at. And so what they intentionally tried to do was bring together scientific data, subject matter expertise, and the community to look at potential health effects from creating this community-based fishing subsistence area. And they took the idea of health and they expanded it beyond just capacity and infrastructure and looked at it as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. And then they focused on 4 aspects of the social determinants of health and how it affects Mo'omi. And that's self-determination and control of resources, traditional marine resource management and the transmission of ancestral knowledge, access to marine resources for family and community subsistence, and commercial fish sales and commercial fisher income. So they put all these together into a package of recommendations to DLNR and said to DLNR, if you're going to implement this rule and create this special area, these are the things that should be taken into account. These are the things to look for to decide, is this being a successful project or not? And DLNR accepted it. So they have taken this into account. This kind of analysis does not appear in typical environmental impact statements in Hawaii right now. It does appear maybe in some other places around the country or globally, and the international impact assessment community is working on how to integrate this more formally into EISs. But right now, it's being done, and it has been done in Hawaii, and it would be great to see more of this kind of input being generated. Now, moving away from the social side, okay, well, so there's 2 more slides that I forgot to put on here. But happily we'll just tell you about them. Have you guys ever been to Seattle? Yeah? Have you ever heard of the Bullitt Center in Seattle? No, it's amazing. And it's a living building. So what's a living building? It's LEED on steroids is basically what it is. So it takes the idea of LEED, and there's this other approach called the Living Building Challenge, which says every building that we do should be net positive in every aspect, not net zero, net positive. So we generate more power than we need. The water is cleaner when it leaves our site than when it comes on. We compost all of our waste. We recycle everything. They have no parking spots. They only have bicycle parking. And there's several other things, including what they call a red list of materials that they recommend not using in buildings. And so they've developed this list of products for construction that have known health concerns. They're not necessarily proven toxic or cancerous, but there's enough research out there to raise credible questions about whether this chemical should be used in a building or not. And so they've compiled a list of it, And then they've created a label that they encourage companies to go through them to get that says, we don't use any item that's on this list in our construction activities. And with the explicit intent to create healthy buildings, to reduce the number of sick buildings out there. This is also something we don't look at in our EIS process. And one of the things that this building in the Bullitt Center did, this Bullitt Center building did, was they decided to actively promote physical activity in their building through good design. So what they did was they took the elevator and they put it in a really inconvenient part of the building. They stuck it in the back. You got to walk through this long hallway and around and back, and it's kind of an ugly little spot. So you really got to need it to go use it. But even that with the elevator, they put the regenerative braking on it, like what Priuses have. So even as the elevator is going up and down, it's helping to generate back some electricity into the building. So there's that. But the real beautiful part about the building is what they called the irresistible stairway. And so they designed the whole building to flow to the stairwell. They set the stairwell up to where it has windows running the length of the building. This is a 6-story commercial building just outside downtown Seattle in the Capitol Hill district. So this stairwell, it's fully windowed, so you can look out over the city of Seattle, and the steps are deliberately set at a height to allow for easy walking up and down. It has broad landings so that lots of people can walk around. And not only that, it has a railing around it that's at a good height for leaning against or putting your laptop on for impromptu meetings. So they're actively encouraging people to meet in the hallway, run into each other, but not impede the flow of traffic going up and down the stairwell. And the whole building moves through this. When I did a site tour of it, there was constantly people going up and down it, chatting, talking, and each floor has businesses in a hallway, and people go in and out. So that's them proactively thinking about how do we put design and make people healthy into their project. And that's something that we don't necessarily do here in Hawaii. The beauty of the environmental impact statement, and yes, I'm asking you to read a 500-page document, is that we have the opportunity to introduce those concepts. And because there's a comment phase on draft documents, so my office will publish a draft environmental assessment, a draft environmental impact statement to the public, and anyone can comment on it. So when you see an EA come out and you think, that's in the wrong place, or wait a minute, the way that they're doing their layout is going to promote a whole lot of mosquitoes because they've got too much sitting water features on here and nothing on the site design that shows how they're going to manage mosquito abatement. That's an opportunity for you all to write a comment letter and say, hey, have you thought about this? And we'd recommend adjusting your site design to this, or implementing some management practices to reduce this, or to improve the physical interconnectivity so people can walk around the building instead of have to use the elevator. These are opportunities for your mana'o to come into the public realm, informally or formally, either through your organization or as individuals, and people to decision makers at the state, county levels to take that into account, to think about it and say, yeah, we do agree with that, or no, we don't have the money, or there's some issues with it. But they might call you, and they might email you and say, hey, this is an interesting idea. We'd like to learn more about it. There's another aspect about you guys commenting on these, and that gets your idea into the public realm and lets other people in the community see these ideas. So you can plant a seed to the community that says, hey, think about these things. Think about mosquito abatement in this area. Here's some facts. Here's some data from our office or our research in public health that we'd like you to take into consideration. And other public members will read that because we publish the comment letters. And so they can read it, and then they can start commenting on it. And now you've gotten a whole community to read your idea. So what I'd like to leave this with is a call to action, which is to ask you all to sign up for our newsletter, to look at EAs and EISs in your neighborhoods or their type of projects that you're interested in, and think about reading them. And not necessarily the whole 500 pages, but the public health section, the proposed action section, and maybe even look at the finals of things that have already been published and see, is this public health description right? Is that capturing the idea of a significant impact that we should be thinking about now? You know, is it okay to just look at beds? Or should we be thinking about the social determinants of health as they relate to this proposed project also? And if you could write a comment letter and help influence the discussion, I think you would be adding tremendously to the public discussion about growth, development, and environment and climate change in Hawaii. So thank you very much.
You know, Mark had made a comment earlier in his talk that really stuck with me, and it was, if you think it's not possible, it's not on your minds. And I think, you know, forums like this, once you know, sort of connect the dots, you see this, you see how it impacts, you see how there's nothing that doesn't get impacted by climate change. You realize that in our daily work, in our daily, you know, comments on EISs even, we need to be thinking about how do we actually make ourselves more resilient? How do we make ourselves more prepared? And it has all these knock-on benefits, right? So it's on our minds now. I don't think you'll be able to read a newspaper without seeing the threads there. And I would encourage you to ask these panelists what's on your mind, and if there's ways that we can help inform the work that you do. Thanks.
We stand up. We stand up.
Yeah. Any questions from the floor? Yeah.
For Mr. Stanbro, there are currently many real estate development projects going up in Kaka'ako and across the island. Do you know if the effects of climate change and high tides were considered when these projects were designed, and was sustainability a factor?
I don't know what the specific considerations were. I suppose there was EISs for some of those projects. The Kaka'ako area, like Waikiki, like Mapunapuna, are among our most low-lying levels. I think you saw with king tides and Mapunapuna, we had fish on the sidewalks. So that is likely, it's not going to get any better, the situation. I would have to go, and having been in 1 month on the job, I'd have to go back and look and see what the considerations were during the approvals for HCDA and Kaka'ako. I think what's concerning as well is, there's a sense that, we can just sort of harden shorelines, or we can build a wall. Chip Fletcher and some of the folks up at SOAS that have been doing analysis around sea level rise are finding that as the water table pushes up, it actually just pushes the water table up. So, even having a wall may not actually help in the end, because you've got water sort of just coming up through the ground, through the water table. It's a lot of karst, I think, out in the area, the Kaka'ako area, which is fairly permeable. It's something we need to take a much closer look at. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
This is an education question. For those of you who interface with the university or other groups, it seems to me that general education of the population is an important dynamic. It's been emphasized. And yet, anybody here from the DOE? Oh, one, good, right. The real question is that it seems to me that we are in a health scientific silo that is not necessarily in discussion with the communication and education of the next generation. Whether the university at all sees this as part of its mission for environmental literacy, or however you might define that. And so my question is, where do you see this going? And are there significant initiatives between what your work is and the University of Hawaii in terms of its students and even in terms of the Department of Education?
Great question. I think the short answer is I think we see this as part of the mission. I can't speak for the entire university. I certainly know colleagues that are very passionate and committed to being both researchers and educators, and you don't find that combination in every academic. And in fact, what we're seeing is an interdisciplinary sort of community that is being supported by entities like the UH Sea Grant College program that is routinely bringing different researchers, scientists, social scientists, economists, et cetera, together to think through some of these problems. So, and to then service the end user broadly defined, whether it's on education or decision makers or public health officials. I think there is that desire, there is that expertise, there is the efforts of interdisciplinary communication. The problem is capacity. There are just very few of us, and I think there needs to be more robust channels. And even the channels that are doing it well, like Sea Grant, Sea Grant is actually the entire program for 33 states that are considered ocean or coastal states is on the chopping block in the Trump budget. Now that budget is not real in the sense that it probably won't be exercised in any way, but if we can contemplate that there are certainly going to be cuts, this is where engagement and in the national and state level conversation is really critical so that we appropriate our resources. The budget, foretells, or at least reflects your priorities. We appropriate our resources to allow for this to support these folks that are working in this area. I will say, thankfully, that at least despite all of the obfuscation and the falsehoods and decades and generations of it, we are actually at a moment where most Americans think that it's happening, that it will be harmful to America. They just don't think it's happening to them, which is amazing, because if you hear that there are fish on the street, which, I was telling a set of students the other day that there was I was doing a sort of guest talk, and I was saying that there were, they have images of baby hammerhead sharks in Mapuna. This is from years ago. This isn't necessarily even a new phenomenon. That is crazy. They all sort of sat back and had no idea that it was actually happening to them. And so understanding how it's happening to you and that it's actually happening all over our country alone is part of the hurdle. Is somehow linking it to our shared experience and our shared future. That's a part of the education, not just of the facts, but of our hopes and dreams and wishes for ourselves. Those kinds of ability to translate that education is also going to be critical.
Just to add to your question, the House legislature, the State House, passed a resolution this year urging the Board of Education to create guidelines for incorporating climate change education into the curriculum of Hawaii's public schools. So I don't know where that is, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Just, there is a discussion, there is an awareness. The legislature is thinking about it, and there's been discussions about how do we get climate change into schools and into teaching kids about this.
And I would just point out too, I think, when Hokulea did its sale, Polynesian Voyaging Society did a really amazing job working with DOE and working with schools to basically have the canoe in constant contact with classrooms, and the kids, they were dropping buckets over the side of the canoe to pick up plastic particles. They were talking about climate change. So having outside partners to work with the schools, I think, can be really helpful, and I really admire the way that they were able to weave, climate into that discussion with kids.
And one last thing I will say, just sort of notwithstanding the earlier comment on where Americans are, is that in this specific issue, there are think tanks of climate deniers that are actively sending out alternative curricula on climate change, saying it's unsettled, and sort of reinserting that uncertainty. So I do think we also, in addition to advancing the conversation, buffering against misinformation is really critical.
Thank you. Hey, I have a question along those education lines. What assessment and education is occurring throughout the state to identify the most risk areas for rising water, and what, if any, is being done to decrease this risk?
Well, right now we have, at the joint effort between the Department of Land and Natural Resources and Office of Planning, a collaborative committee called the Island Climate Adaptation Committee, which is working with state and county agencies to look at sea level rise and climate change more broadly, adaptation measures that we can take. This committee is starting with sea level rise, but plans to move on and expand that discussion once it figures out a method. So it's using sea level rise first as its method or its, what's the word, like, its strategy of figuring out how to go about doing these looks. And then once it gets that figured out, apply that method to health, to fresh water, to other aspects of the environment and Hawaii. So that's the first step. And there's a bill that came out of the legislature this year that would transform this committee into a climate change commission that would actively working on the Paris Accord if it gets signed into law. So we might be taking that climate change committee and turning it into something larger and even better.
I would also point out that some of the utilities are doing really interesting work. The Board of Water Supply is doing a study right now around sea level rise and infrastructure vulnerability. So where are there pipes? Where are those likely to get impacted? And they're working with SOEST, with Chip Fletcher again, to analyze all the way around the island here on Oahu with a 1 foot level of sea level rise, 2 feet, 3 feet, et cetera, where the critical infrastructure is and how to best either harden, relocate, or underground some of that so that it's not as vulnerable. So I think we have some really good public servants in the public utility space that are taking it seriously and already acting to try to improve the situation.
Thank you. Before we get to Jimmy, Jimmy has a question, but I also have another question. This one's for Scott. Scott, hey, did the Bullitt building, as you mentioned in Seattle, meet ADA requirements with no parking spaces, as well as that elevator being so far away? Good question.
Great question. I never asked them. I don't know. I imagine if it didn't, there was some kind of waiver in place, but they're very conscientious about being accessible. So I imagine, I would have to guess there's something there.
Hello, my name is Jimmy. I'm from the University of Hawaii. I'm speaking as a private citizen. Dan Mazenthal is our mouthpiece. I won't play his game. So we're talking about variances and laws and everything else. And yet it took the Supreme Court decision to overrule a Honolulu Department of Public Planning permitting variance regarding the Keolia development here a couple years back about them dumping sand, which now made, hey, we're now far enough away from the water, you can get this variance from the DPP. And it had to go to the Hawaii State Supreme Court to overturn that. And so the question and concern I have, seeing that we have legal and government representatives and climate change, it was like they already knew that the beach is going to erode, and yet they want to dump sand so they can have a variance to build a hotel. And now we have more of these condominiums and other facilities with already a infrastructure that's already tapped out, backed up sewage in Kaka'ako area. We already know the problems, and yet we are still allowing these things to occur.
That's deep, Jimmy.
So-
Very deep. Good.
Without getting into the specifics of the Keolia project, the Waikiki businesses got together and created a self-taxation district. Are you guys aware of this? So they are now taxing themselves to pay for beach improvements and other things that would protect the businesses along Waikiki Beach and to help restore the beach. So maybe slightly editorializing, the previous effort that you talked about was maybe an older way of trying to tackle these issues. And now they've gotten together and actually created a structured way to pool their money together and work together on some of these climate change threats that they see and acknowledge as mutual issues. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point. And it's at least these businesses are putting money up front to help pay for preventing further damage to their properties. Now there's a longer term, larger issue of retreat and inundation and everything going on with Waikiki. But for the immediate future, they're at least working together, trying to tackle this challenge as a group.
I would just point out, too, that the challenges to here where we sit in Waikiki come from both directions. There's an analysis around a 100-year flood and what that would do from the Alawai side. And I think there's a Alawai Watershed Cooperative, I think, which is working on, is there a way to do multiple things spread throughout the community that could actually have health benefits if you're doing things with swales and green space and park space and open space as water basins and catchment to try to protect the economic engine of Waikiki that could have other knock-on side benefits. And so there's an Army Corps plan which is basically proposing putting a wall along the Alawai, but there's this parallel effort to try to see if there's other ways to mitigate flood damage from the freshwater side to Waikiki. So I don't think any of us up here can pretend that this isn't a very difficult, complex. We've got a lot of sunk costs and we have a lot of sunk infrastructure that were built under a model of sort of last century. I think the challenge for us is to try to create awareness and begin to work on the sort of the economics around making it in the incentivizing good development that'll stand the test of time, as opposed to things that will wind up costing us in the long run because we're going to be having to react to things that were built that aren't anticipating what's happening in the next century.
I'll just say, someone who doesn't work for the city or the state, and certainly doesn't speak for the university either, as an individual that, I think the silence initially was because of sort of like amen, right? This is something that we know. And the underlying issue is that we are in a scenario in which most industries are not internalizing the costs of their business. They're externalizing it. So we're all feeling the impacts, whether it's asthma rates or it's the impacts of sea level rise and sort of the poor governance or the resistance to the kinds of difficult conversations we need to have about managed retreat, for example, moving forward. So I would just like to sort of further emphasize two things. One is that, yay lawyers, sometimes, right? Which is, at least it made it to the Supreme Court, right? This is the backstop that's so very necessary. And this is why we need to continue to support our attorneys that are kind of the watchdogs and are doing that work and recognize that there's nuance to that. And it's working. It ought not take so long along the process, but we have an opportunity to continue to support those folks. But on the front end, that's where we need the work. So we have now 10 years of pretty good legislation around climate change preparedness. What are we continuing to do the work as private citizens to make sure that it's executed effectively? Are we pressuring our legislators, our council members? We have a new Office of Climate Change with Sustainability and Resilience. Are we going to make sure that it's fully staffed and that we follow its mandates, even when it makes tough decisions that affect your life? Right? Knowing how to continue to engage is going to be critical so that we have the front end and not just the lawyers at the back end that are trying to sort of stop the flood, if you will.
One more comment. So, October 30th, 2004, here we are 13 years later, and that bridge in Pac Manoa with $100 million of damages is still not fixed.
I don't know the specifics of it, but again, budget reflects priority. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here. I think we need to lean in our conversations about how we budget things in our city and state. That's one element of it. But I completely agree with you. I could give you a list, right? And we could share one, I'm sure. But the response, I think, moving forward is that we're going to see more of that, especially if you're relying on leveraging federal funding. We're going to see more of that. And so how do we prioritize and make decisions based on that scenario moving forward?
I have one question. What about our islands, climate change and food sustainability? Are you looking at that?
So under the plan for the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency, not in the next fiscal year, but the one after that, if the council provides funds, it would add a local food coordinator to look at how does agriculture thrive in a climate-affected scenario. We've already seen, though, the folks that are closest to this are really ranchers, and Sumner Erdman on Maui, folks at Parker Ranch on Big Island have been seeing exactly what's happening with rainfall, what's happening with crop production, or the calving, because if you don't get green grass and rains, then your calving goes down and you end up having to ship all the cows to the mainland for raising up over there. So I mean, the ag industry has been already impacted, especially on the ranching side, by climate change and the drought period. I don't know if there's anything more that you can offer from the state side.
Certainly, we're looking to improve local food production across the state for our own island resiliency. There's some concerns about taro, for example. Our keynote speaker mentioned how taro fields are starting to get saltwater inundation, and that's happening in Hawaii too, not just the Marshall Islands. And it's a big issue because it's something we're trying to promote: local food production, self-sufficiency, using Hawaii's basically foods appropriate to Hawaii and culturally resonant with the people of Hawaii. It's tough. And Hanalei, for example, we have enormous taro fields there. They're beautiful. People go out and work on them, and they're at risk. And so we're going to have to figure out not only how to retreat beaches, but how do we retreat fields and farms and taro. So that's all under consideration. I don't know that there's good answers yet.
I would just add, though, that it's part of the solution as well. So when agriculture is done right, when you sort of plow your fields in a way that the swales, the contour lines run the right way along the hillsides, you actually can capture those big rains when they fall and prevent runoff from getting in and water quality issues and health that result from that, runoff of nutrients. Over in He'ia, I don't know if you've been over to He'ia, but the whole idea with that restoration of taro lo'i in that wetland is to try to capture sediment coming down off the mountain and try to prevent it from getting into Kaneohe Bay. So if you do ag with, what was the quote? If it's not possible, it's not on your mind. If it's on your mind when you're doing the agriculture, that climate change is part of what you're trying to mitigate some of the impacts of, you can actually do a great deal while we're growing local food to protect our health on the back end in terms of runoff and other things. So there's creative ways to address it.
Maybe just one more comment on that, sorry. The legislature also passed out a bill for the Office of Planning to convene a task force to look at soil carbon sequestration that would help pull carbon out of the atmosphere and promote soil health to help our agricultural food production.
Yeah, I have two questions. One was that you showed the classroom with the kids being real high with the grandparents of 7 grandkids. That bothers me. One of the best investments I ever made was the $30,000 for photovoltaic on my house. It's already paid for itself. I put $5,000 now a year back in my pocket, right? So why aren't the schools going to that direction? And the second part is, does Hawaii have a desalination plant that would take care of all your water problem needs?
I can do the first one. Okay, so on the first question about schools, so the governor announced a goal to cool 1,000 classrooms, right? And we're working on it. So some of the issues with that is the buildings are old and they don't have electric wiring to support the photovoltaics, or the roofs are old and they can't support putting photovoltaics on them. So some of these projects that we thought would be just putting fans, putting air conditioners, putting solar PV and using it to power air conditioning have become complicated building renovations. And it's slowed down a lot of the process of trying to improve these rooms. Plus, trying to do it during the school year makes it hard because a lot of schools don't have backup classrooms where kids can go meet, do their testing, do their studies while a room is being renovated or a portion of the building is being renovated. So these are kind of all obstacles that are being overcome, but they just have slowed things down from the initial push of the thinking, let's just plug in some ACs and we're cooling the air conditioners because we were burning wings of schools out by doing that. And then we really had to pay a lot of money to fix the wiring and that side. So we are working on it, and those are some of the issues with moving quickly on it. but we are doing it. We also, legislature appropriates some money from the GEMS fund, if you're familiar with that, which is a whole ball of wax and a huge problem in and of itself. But there's a pot of money sitting there that they're going to use to help go and move the renovation of these schools faster to provide some money for that. So, so we are working on that one. Second question?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the desalination. Board of Water Supply has long had in their sort of backup plans desalination at some point if need be. The issue with desalination is obviously it's really energy intensive. So if we should all be worried about cost of living here and expenses and utilities. It takes so much energy to power a desal plant that the price, I think, is something like 2 or 3 times the amount of water that we get naturally out of the watershed. So it would jack up the water bill considerably, and then you have the issue of where does the brine go, which is another probably a health issue. So it is possible, but there are factors that make it less attractive. Although I do think Representative Yamane is here, and he had looked at doing a pilot over on Ka'olave around doing desal, because there they actually don't have an option, right? I mean, they don't have a watershed capturing rainfall, and so for potable purposes as well as ag and watering, just getting that fresh water is precious enough to try to do desal on that island. And I think if that goes there, then we can see what the results might be. I think, if there's one final question, we can take it, but I think we're at lunchtime, if I am correct.
Anyone, final question, anybody?
All right.
No? Hey, how about a nice round of applause? I told you he was a great guy.